The fatal error that led to the fall of a civilization. Once, there was a civilization unlike any other society that thrived in harmony with the land, reaching astonishing heights in art, architecture, and science. Its people, known for their ingenuity and deep understanding of the natural world, built cities that stretched across vast, fertile plains. They were masters of agriculture, harnessing the power of irrigation systems that turned dry lands into abundant fields. Their architecture rose like mountains, and their astronomical observatories reached into the stars. But this great civilization had one fatal flaw: an insatiable thirst for growth and an inability to recognize when enough was enough. It began as a small mistake, almost unnoticed by those who governed the land. As the cities flourished, the people sought more and more from the earth, constantly pushing the boundaries of their agricultural and architectural expansion. Forests were cleared to make room for fields, and more rivers were diverted to water crops. They had learned to tame the land, but in their ambition, they forgot that the land, too, had its limits. The rulers, driven by the desire to show off the power and wealth of their civilization, decided to undertake a grand project, a massive expansion of their irrigation system. The idea was brilliant. With more water, the harvests would grow, and the cities would expand even further. But in their haste, they failed to consider the long-term effects of their actions. The delicate balance of nature was disturbed. As the rivers were diverted, the land began to suffer. The soil, once rich with nutrients, started to erode. The forests, cleared to make space for crops, could no longer protect the land from the scorching sun and heavy rains. The irrigation channels, though abundant in the beginning, began to carry away precious topsoil, leaving the fields barren and dry. Droughts followed, and the once bountiful crops began to wither. The water sources, once a lifeline, dried up in some places and flooded others. The people who had once been at the mercy of the land's gifts now found themselves at the mercy of their own choices. In the cities, panic set in. The rulers, who had grown accustomed to wealth and power, failed to understand the full scope of the crisis. They blamed the gods for their misfortune, but the truth was far simpler. They had made a choice that ignored the wisdom of nature. They had believed that growth, expansion, and control were the keys to immortality, but now their cities were crumbling, their fields were failing, and their people were starving. As the situation worsened, the leaders became desperate. They sent expeditions to find new sources of water, but their attempts were futile. The damage had already been done. The civilization that once seemed invincible began to disintegrate. The great cities that had reached for the sky now lay abandoned, their walls cracked and overgrown with weeds. The people, once prosperous and proud, were scattered, their knowledge and culture lost to time. The collapse came swiftly, but the consequences would echo through history. Generations later, when explorers stumbled upon the ruins, they would wonder what had brought down such a mighty civilization. They would look at the crumbling temples and broken statues, and see not just the remnants of a lost society, but a warning that no civilization, no matter how grand, could survive if it ignored the balance of nature and the cost of unchecked ambition. The fatal error was not the lack of intelligence or innovation, it was the failure to recognize limits. In the pursuit of more land, more wealth, more power, civilization had forgotten the fundamental truth that every civilization depends on the land that sustains it, and when that land is pushed too far, it can no longer provide. And so, the civilization fell, not because it was weak, but because it had been too strong for its own good. Blinded by the belief that it could control the forces of nature, the fatal error had been made. As time passed, the ruins of the once great civilization became little more than a silent reminder of what had been lost. Generations grew up in the shadow of its failure. The stories of its glory and collapse passed down as legends, whispered around campfires and recounted in the humble villages that now dotted the landscape where grand cities had once stood. Those who came after had learned a hard truth that civilizations, no matter how advanced, were fragile and subject to the whims of forces beyond their control. But even in the face of destruction, the seeds of wisdom had been sown. In the distant hills, small communities of survivors began to rebuild their lives, living in harmony with the land. They took lessons from the fall of the great civilization, learning from its mistakes. Agriculture was practiced with care, not just for immediate gain but with a long-term perspective, understanding the need to conserve resources and replenish the earth that nourished them. Forests were no longer cleared recklessly, rather, they were respected. seen as essential to the health of the ecosystem. The knowledge of the ancient builders, how scattered and fragmented, was not lost entirely. The surviving texts and scrolls, stored in hidden libraries, contain precious insights into astronomy, engineering, and medicine. These fragments were carefully preserved and passed down through the generations, helping to guide the people as they rebuilt their culture in a more sustainable way. However, the damage caused by the civilization's recklessness was not easily undone. The land took centuries to recover, and even then, the scars were still visible. Rivers that had once flowed freely were now unpredictable, sometimes swollen with floods, other times reduced to dry beds. The soil, exhausted by centuries of overuse, had to be carefully restored before it could yield life again. Still, the survivors' resilience became a story of its own. They did not allow the fall of their ancestors to define their future. Instead of despairing over the loss, they took it as a warning, a lesson passed down through the ages about the dangers of hubris and unchecked ambition. Over time, their societies grew, not in the grandiose manner of their predecessors, but in a way that was measured and mindful. The cities that arose were smaller, more sustainable, built not to dominate the land, but to coexist with it. Agriculture and commerce flourished, but the people remained keenly aware of the delicate balance that had been shattered once before. As centuries turned into millennia, the story of the fall of the great civilization became a myth, a cautionary tale that was taught to children, sung in songs, and inscribed on the walls of temples. The ancient ruins were preserved not just as remnants of a bygone era, but as symbols of the lessons learned through tragedy. The once mighty civilization, which had fallen victim to its own errors, now served as the foundation for a new Aegea civilization built on respect for the land, humility before nature, and the wisdom of knowing one's limits. The fatal error that had led to the fall of the great civilization was no longer viewed as a simple mistake, but as a pivotal turning point in human history. It became a symbol of the dangers of overreach, of the perils of believing that technology and power could conquer nature without consequence. And as new generations rose, they did so with the knowledge that while ambition could lead to great heights, it was only through balance and respect that true prosperity could be sustained. In the end, the greatest lesson of all was this, that civilizations, like the land they inhabit, must be nurtured and cared for. Only then can they thrive, not just for a time, but for generations to come. The fatal error had been made, but through the fall, humanity had gained the wisdom to rise, again wiser, humbler, and more in tune with the earth beneath their feet. As the centuries passed, the memory of the great civilization's fall faded into the mist of time, but its lessons remained embedded in the cultures that followed. New empires arose, new cities were built, and new technologies were invented. Yet, the foundational principles that emerged from the collapse continued to shape the course of history. The survivors who have rebuilt their society were remembered not as victims of disaster but as visionaries, those who had grasped the wisdom that life is a fragile and precious balance. Their way of living became the blueprint for future generations. While ambitious projects and innovations still sparked excitement, they were tempered by a deep understanding of their limitations. The people of these new societies no longer sought to dominate nature, but rather to understand and coexist with it. Governments, now more aware of their responsibility to the land and the people, began to shift their priorities. Leaders, no longer blinded by unchecked ambition, placed the well-being of the environment alongside economic prosperity. Laws were passed to protect forests, rivers, and wildlife, and sustainable practices became the norm rather than the exception. Agricultural techniques were refined over generations, using methods that preserved soil fertility, conserved water, and respected the cycles of nature. The wisdom of the past, passed down through stories, books, and teachings, guided the decisions of the people. One such empire, a kingdom born from the ashes of the great civilization, rose to prominence not by conquest, but by cooperation. They understood that power did not lie in overwhelming force, but in the strength of a society that knew how to adapt. They became the keepers of ancient knowledge, curating and safeguarding the lessons learned from the mistakes of their ancestors. Great libraries were established, not just to house books and scrolls, but as centers of wisdom where scholars and philosophers gathered to discuss and debate the future of civilization. the once reckless ambition of the past gave way to an era of measured exploration. In the distant corners of the world, new lands were discovered, and the knowledge of navigation, engineering, and astronomy advanced. Yet, the explorers and inventors of this new age traveled not to conquer, but to learn. They built partnerships with indigenous peoples, shared knowledge, and respected the land they entered. Even as the world evolved and new challenges arose, whether from conflict, natural disasters, or the emergence of new technologies, the core lesson of the fall of the ancient civilization remained a guiding principle. The balance between growth and preservation, between progress and sustainability, became the foundation for every society that followed. But there were moments when the shadow of the past reappeared. In times of prosperity, when the land seemed to give generously and the people grew complacent, the ancient lesson was sometimes forgotten. Some rulers, intoxicated by power, sought to push the boundaries once again, to expand their dominion and claim more resources. In those moments, the old stories were recounted, whispers of the civilization that had been undone by its own ambition. These stories were not just cautionary tales, they were warnings, kept alive by storytellers, historians, and sages who ensured that future generations would remember. It was said that the ghost of the ancient civilization still lingered, a silent watcher waiting for any who might forget the lesson of balance and humility. And when the people strayed too far from the path, it was as if the echoes of the past stirred in the wind, reminding them of the price of ambition unchecked. Despite these occasional setbacks, the world had learned to move forward with a sense of purpose and reverence. The old ruins, once the epitome of a fallen empire, had become sacred sites, places for reflection and meditation, where travelers and citizens alike could stand in the presence of the past and contemplate the fragile nature of civilization. The lessons of the Great Fall were preserved not just in books or temples, but in the hearts and minds of the people. And so, life continued. The world did not forget the great civilization that had once reached for the stars, nor did it forget the fatal error that had led to its demise. Instead, that civilization's rise and fall became a part of the greater human narrative, woven into the fabric of history. The memory of their mistakes no longer served as a burden, but as a guided compass pointing the way forward, ensuring that future generations would always remember that true greatness lies not in domination or conquest, but in the wisdom to know when enough is enough. The civilization of the past had fallen, but through their mistakes, the world had learned how to rise. It had learned to balance ambition with caution, to temper growth with preservation, and to live in harmony with the land that sustains us all. In the end, it was not the ambition of one civilization that defined the future, it was the humility of learning from that fall, and in doing so, finding a path to a more sustainable, enduring existence for all. As the years turned into centuries, the world that emerged from the ashes of the ancient civilization began to look very different. The mistakes of the past were no longer distant memories or faded. Stories had become the very foundation of the way people lived, thought, and interacted with the world around them. The knowledge passed down from those who had survived. The Great Fall became the guiding star for the future. Yet, as with all things, the balance that had been achieved through careful stewardship was never static. Life's rhythms ebbed and flowed, and so did the challenges that each generation faced. The great lesson of humility and restraint had not been forgotten, but the world had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. New technologies began to emerge, innovations that could connect people across vast distances, manipulate the very elements of nature, and harness the forces of energy that had once seemed beyond reach. With each new advancement came the promise of a better life, more comfort, more power. Yet, these same technologies posed new risks, for they could be wielded irresponsibly, as the ancients had once done. The question arose once again, would the world heed the lessons of the past, or would it fall prey to the same reckless ambitions that had once brought down an entire civilization? In the growing cities, bustling with innovation and commerce, there was a palpable sense of excitement. New materials were being invented that could revolutionize architecture, new machines that could produce goods at a speed never before imagined. These were tools of progress, and many saw them as signs that the mistakes of the past were behind them. But there were whispers of doubt. In the corners of quiet rooms and around village fires, older generations, who had known the stories of the fall firsthand, cautioned the young to be careful. The land had been scarred before, and there were signs that the world was stretching the same limits it had once breached. The Earth, though resilient, was not infinite. Waterways were again being altered, forests cleared for new technologies and industries. The pressure on the land was increasing once more, and though people had learned to tread carefully, the temptation of progress often clouded judgment. In the name of efficiency, a harmony that had been so carefully crafted between nature and society began to unravel. Governments, once more dedicated to ensuring the well-being of both people and planet, found themselves at a crossroads. Globalization and the interconnectedness of the modern world had created new problems: climate change, resource depletion, and pollution that seemed beyond the scope of any one nation or group. The very systems that had brought prosperity to some were now beginning to threaten the future of all. The lessons of the ancient civilization weighed heavily on the minds of world leaders, but the challenge was no longer about building or expanding. It was about preservation, about ensuring that the mistakes of the past did not repeat themselves on a global scale. At the heart of this struggle, there were voices of hope. Young activists, scientists, and thinkers rallied for a new era of sustainability. They called for a shift in mindset to return to the wisdom of old, but with new tools and knowledge at their disposal. They didn't want to abandon progress, they wanted to harness it responsibly. They spoke of a future where technological advances could coexist with the natural world, where humanity's ambition would no longer clash with the Earth's fragile balance. These voices echoed the ancient wisdom, reminding the world of the lessons passed down through generations, that growth without respect for the environment leads to ruin, that true power comes not from domination but from cooperation, and that the Earth's resources must be stewarded with care, for they are finite. Slowly, change began to take root. New policies were adopted to protect ecosystems and slow the damage to the climate. Communities began to adopt more sustainable lifestyles, embracing renewable energy, organic farming, and conservation efforts. Technology was used not to conquer nature, but to heal it, to restore forests, clean oceans, and bring back species that had been lost. In the cities, a new form of growth emerged, one focused not on expansion at any cost, but on regeneration. Architects and engineers worked with the land, designing buildings that blended seamlessly with their environment, creating green spaces that helped cool the earth and purify the air. Education systems, too, began to teach sustainability as a core principle, ensuring that future generations would never forget the lessons of the past. As the world adapted to the challenges of the new age, it became clear that the fall of the great civilization had not been in vain. The knowledge they left behind, the mistakes they made, and the wisdom they passed on had guided humanity through its darkest moments. The fatal error had been costly, but in the end, it had forged a path to a more thoughtful, responsible, and connected world. The story of the great civilization's rise and fall, what's seen as a tragedy, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the resilience of humanity and the possibility of redemption. For in every fall, there is the chance to rise again, and in every mistake, there is the opportunity to learn and grow. The world, forever shaped by the lessons of the past, moved forward, knowing that true greatness lies not in unrestrained ambition, but in the humility to recognize when enough is enough, and in the wisdom to nurture the world that sustains us all.